Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's somewhat unique for me to speak to such a group. Almost entirely, the audiences to which I speak are people who already have a strong interest in the paranormal, and I see this is a mixed group. And however, you're very consistent with the statistics for people all across the United States, even though religious attendance or affiliation with organized religions has been dropping steadily decade by decade. A number of Americans who believe in life after death has remained constant at about 70% over the decades. So that suggests something very important to me, which is that the belief in the afterlife isn't based strictly on religious indoctrination. It's based on other things that I would call the evidence. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get started, I really want to acknowledge your president, Patricia Fripp, because I was very blessed to win $500,000 in the Bigelow competition for my essay on the best evidence for survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. And it was a big event held at the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation, and I put together an acceptance speech, but Patricia very graciously worked with me sentence by sentence to get that speech honed perfectly. And it went over well at the award ceremony. And then Patricia said, would you mind if I submitted your speech to the Cicero Awards competition? And to my surprise, the speech won first prize in the 2021 Cicero Awards for the best award acceptance speech of the year. So I'm deeply indebted and very grateful for Patricia's help, and for any of you who are thinking about getting some professional coaching in your speaking career, or even if you do occasional public speeches like I do. She's a wonderful go-to resource that you have right here in the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. And I thought what I would do is share with you some excerpts from that acceptance speech to give you an idea of how my life was completely transformed by a very brief contact with the afterlife. And I can say this right now, with regard to belief. I had an interesting conversation with the judges of the Bigelow competition, and whether they believed in life after death after reading all of the essays that won awards. And they told me basically, some of them were still not convinced. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, I haven't had any personal experience. And it seems that that is the demarcation. If you have had a personal experience, such as several people shared in the introductions here, you have no doubt. People who have had near-death experiences, 99% come back and say, I have no doubt whatsoever about the afterlife. I've been there. But if you haven't had the experience, it's very natural to have doubts, even if you've been thoroughly indoctrinated by your religion. One other thing I want to mention before I get going is that if you're interested in having that 5-volume set that contains all 28 of the winning essays, I can enter your name in a lottery. I'm told by Robert Bigelow, is very graciously donating these books to me to give away, that there are lots of them. So chances are, if you enter the lottery, you'll probably receive a set. And what you need to do is just put in the chat that you would like a set of the books and put your name, your email address, your telephone number, and your shipping address. And we'll take it from there. If you had known me when I was 25 years old in 1972, you would have seen a criminology graduate student volunteering in the psychiatric ward of San Quentin Prison, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. Imagine how I felt then when, upon awakening from a dream that felt more real than real, I was crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing one of the most sacred songs from my Jewish religious tradition, Avinu Malkeinu, which is typically sung only in the high holy holiday rituals. Although I didn't realize it then, that was the moment that led me to my destiny of being here with you today. My great uncle Harry appeared to me in that dream. We communicated at a soul-to-soul level. I was so touched. I wrote home and asked how Uncle Harry was. And my mother immediately phoned and she said, "Jeffrey, how did you know that was just when Uncle Harry died?" There's an old song from World War I that goes, "How do you keep them down on the farm once they've been to Gay Paris?" After an experience of the afterlife, how could I go back to running therapy groups at San Quentin Prison? Against all odds and all advice, I took a step and created an individual interdisciplinary doctoral major in parapsychology. Even today, if a student says, "I'd like to have a career in parapsychology," they will probably hear from every knowledgeable person, "Get a degree in some conventional field first, establish yourself, wait until you become tenured, then you can begin to explore the parapsychological dimensions of life." But imagine my pride in 1980 when I opened the package that contained my doctoral diploma and saw my degree from the University of California at Berkeley. I wonder if they were embarrassed to give it to me. To this day, it remains the only doctoral diploma that says parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited American university. Of course, that made it impossible to have a conventional academic career. But along the way, I was able to found a couple of academic programs that did receive accreditation for advanced distant learning degrees that offered courses in parapsychology. And actually, I'm on the verge of setting up, for the first time after 44 years of getting my degree, opportunities for other students to do exactly what I did. But mostly, I've been able to pursue my interests through radio, television, and video. I've been blessed to have intimate conversations with the thought leaders in our field. In fact, many of the prize winners and other contestants of the competition were included in my essay because it included 70 video excerpts with 18 individuals talking about their personal experiences of the afterlife, and yet another 18 scholars commenting on those experiences. And I should add, for any of you who are interested in seeing all those video excerpts that were in the essay, you can download the PDF copy from the Bigelow Institute website, bigelowinstitute.org. And you will find in the PDF copy direct links to all of those video excerpts that are not, unfortunately, in the printed copy. You can see the URLs, but you can't click on them, of course. In 1994, I had the privilege of interviewing Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for his participation in the discovery of the double helix structure of the DNA molecule. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that this was one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. It was his intention to launch a research effort to demonstrate that consciousness is produced by the brain. Yet he said to me on camera, "Jeffrey, this is just an unproven hypothesis. Science has yet to establish that consciousness is created by the brain. In fact, the religious point of view that consciousness survives death might actually be correct." This would surprise many people who think that science has already proven that the brain creates consciousness. Not true. Another person whom I included in my essay is my good friend Russell Targ, who worked closely for a decade with Hal Puthoff at SRI International, pioneering the field of remote viewing. And today we can say there are thousands of people practicing remote viewing, which, for those of you who don't know, is an updated name for what used to be known as clairvoyance. And for those of you who don't know, the US government funded that work at SRI and elsewhere for a 20-year period, year after year, because they were producing results for the intelligence community. In 2002, Russell's beautiful daughter, Elizabeth, who was a friend of mine, died at the age of 41. She was a vibrant person, a psychiatrist, and a parapsychology researcher herself. Shortly after her death, Russell, Elizabeth's husband, and even total strangers received communications from her. For example, Elizabeth's friend, Jane Catra, was interviewing for a job at Duke University. During a break, she was approached by a staff member who asked her if she knew a woman with long dark hair who had recently died. "She's with me now," the staff member said, "and she's urging me to give you a message to pass on to her father, who doesn't believe in the afterlife. But this will convince him. She's telling me that when she was 2 years old, he forced her to wear a red dress that she refused to wear and tore it off. And when Russell heard this, he realized that he was the only living person who knew about this event because his wife, who was with him at the time, had already died. This convinced Russell, a hard-nosed laser physicist, of the reality of Elizabeth's postmortem existence. And I can report that a year after her death, Elizabeth appeared to me in a dream. Like my dream of Uncle Harry, this one also was more real than real. And I said to her in the dream, "Elizabeth, I'm so glad to see you. I am so impressed with the many communications that you have provided, especially the physical ones." And just as I was saying, especially the physical ones, the phone next to my bed rang. It was 3 a.m. I picked it up. White noise. As a parapsychologist, I would consider this an example of what is known as instrumental transcommunication. And I can tell you that today there are tens of thousands of hobbyists attempting to communicate with deceased friends and loved ones using various types of electronic equipment, radios, computers, telephones. Since I won the Bigelow Award, many people have told me, "Jeffrey, this is a validation of your risky decision nearly 50 years ago to pursue a doctoral degree in parapsychology." And I think it's true. But the question worth asking is why people such as myself, and there are many others, hundreds of people who have dedicated their careers to exploring scientifically, if possible, the nature of the afterlife. Why are people doing that? In my opinion, the answer is simple. It's about self-knowledge. Knowledge of the afterlife is ultimately knowledge about human consciousness. And to the extent that the human civilization is not exploring this field, we are woefully lacking in self-knowledge. And that is a very serious gap in our understanding. So basically, when we look at the post-mortem survival of human consciousness from an academic scientific point of view, I can tell you that there are 9 different lines independent of independent evidence, all pointing toward, not proving, but pointing toward the survival of consciousness after death. And they include near-death. We now know that there are probably millions of people who have had these near-death experiences. I never had one, but you could say that my experience with Uncle Harry was something akin to a near-death experience. Some people talk about a shared death experience, that Uncle Harry took me along with him partway on his journey. There's also research in reincarnation at the University of Virginia, for example. There are some 2,500 cases in their database of young children who, as soon as they can begin to talk, begin describing a past life that they lived in a different household, in a different village, and they describe the people who they knew in that previous life. And in 1,700 of those cases, researchers have been able to actually identify who the past life person was, the previous person, as they like to call it. So that's, we can't say that everybody experiences reincarnation, but we have a lot of very interesting statistics about why young children seem to remember it. First of all, more boys than girls. And second of all, more people who have had violent deaths in their previous life seem to remember them. Maybe that's why there are more boys. 90% of the time, the sex is the same. So there's a lot of specific research that can be gathered from these cases. And that is being done today. The program at the University of Virginia has been ongoing for the last 50 years. Related to reincarnation are cases of possession. This would be an example where in a classic case of possession, an individual will get ill, they'll be dead or on the verge of death, sometimes pronounced dead, and then suddenly the body sits up and starts talking, but it's a different person inside. Another way to think of this is replacement reincarnation as opposed to possession. But it's rare, but there are at least a dozen such cases in the scholarly literature, cases of possession. Instrumental transcommunication, I've spoken about earlier. Some of the most extreme cases are those in which when the telephone rings, it's a deceased person. You may have a conversation with them that could run a half hour. You may not know that the person is deceased while you're speaking to them. That would probably be too strange. It's probably a person you think is still alive, maybe one who has recently died. Then, of course, the strangest manifestations are associated with physical mediumship. And there are many cases on record with credible witnesses testifying towards full-bodied materialization in a spiritualist seance. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I've come to learn through my 50 years of experience in parapsychology that things that seem unbelievable actually do happen and are reported by sane, sober, credible people. Mental mediumship is a little easier to handle. Mental mediumship has been explored now for about 150 years. The Society for Psychical Research was first formed in Great Britain in 1882. And they began studying mental mediums. William James, who's considered the father of American psychology, discovered one of the greatest mediums ever to be researched, Lenora Piper, who began her research in the 1880s and lived until the 1950s and was consistently available for research throughout that entire period. One of the most well-researched mediums in history, and many, many examples from numerous sessions that people have had with her where she is able to come up with what they call paranormal information, in which a deceased spirit will come through her and begin providing information that only that person could have known. Xenoglossy is a phenomenon. It's rare, but there are about half a dozen cases reported in the literature where people are able to speak a language, sometimes an archaic language, that they never had the opportunity to learn while they were alive. Pekindarian experiences. This is a very interesting one. The phrase Pekindarian comes from a poem by John Keats, and it refers to the Spanish explorer Cortez. When he came to the Isthmus of Panama, his men climbed a peak in the province of Darien, and they were surprised when they got to the top of the peak to look out and see the Pacific Ocean on the other side. So Pekindarian experience is when you're confronted with something totally unexpected. And the classic case of this would be when people are having deathbed visions, they're dying. Very often they see their deceased loved ones coming to greet them. This is extremely common. But sometimes coming amongst the deceased people coming to greet them is somebody not known to be deceased at the time, a person who the dying person thought was alive, but there they are on the other side already waiting to greet them. The importance of these experiences is simply that it contradicts the idea that the dying person's experience of deceased loved ones is simply a wish fulfillment fantasy. A wish fulfillment fantasy would not include people who you think are still alive. And finally, the most common experience of all, after-death communications. And you could say that my experience with Uncle Harry was an after-death communication, or my dream experience with Elizabeth Targ was an after-death communication. These are very common. People report them in any number of ways. In dreams is probably the most common, but they can occur through visionary experiences. They can occur through synchronicities. And sometimes it's a question simply of you want to have a conversation with somebody and there they are. Now, I'll stop sharing since I've gone through the list. There's a lot more to say. It's a wealth of information. The evidence actually for survival after death, if you were to consider all of the scientific reports that have accumulated in the proceedings and journals of the Society for Psychical Research and the American Society for Psychical Research and other societies throughout the world over the last 150 years, is absolutely overwhelming. So in the Bigelow essay, the goal was to present your case as if you were in a courtroom, and you wanted to present a case that would be acceptable by a rational person beyond any reasonable doubt. And I believe that the evidence actually does achieve that level of conviction. So I'm very happy at this point to throw the floor open to your questions.
Well, first of all, that was wonderful. It was really superb. So I'm giving you a yay. And thank you for the shout out. But being there was fabulous. And I'm going to put this on gallery view so that I can see. And I know I saw your past President Kathy. You've got your hand raised first that I can see. You take the first question.
I thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I do have to, and the tee up, Fripp, you're phenomenal for teeing things up the way you do. So, but one of my favorite authors, and I listened to her podcast, Lynn McTaggart, who wrote the book The Field decades ago, and has since taken that scientific approach and just have it touching so many aspects of the world. And then I just read a book by Deepak Chopra called The Quantum Body, which is, again, a scientific fact that proves that we're more than our body, we're more than what we think about, we're the energy emanating out. So in your studies of life after death, how can this knowledge impact the world we live in today? The knowing of the more than just what we see. How do you see it as an impact in the world we live in today?
Thank you. It's a very good question. I'm glad you brought up Lynn McTaggart. She's a friend. She has been a guest on the New Thinking Aloud channel. I'm particularly fond of her book, The Power of Eight, because she points out that if you get a small group of people, like 8 people together, and they project out into the world a positive intention, for example, to reduce gun violence, or to, in the city of San Francisco, to reduce drug addiction, or any particular social problem, Lynn McTaggart has discovered in doing over 40 experiments of this type that they actually have an effect in the world, that they can change social conditions. Now, what does that have to do with the afterlife? If you talk to people who have had near-death experiences, 95% of them will tell you that they enter into a realm of consciousness which is best described as pure love. And when you're in that realm, you don't just experience pure love around you, you experience it within you. You become it. Because everything in that realm is interconnected and, as quantum physicists like to say, entangled. We are entangled with everything. And ultimately, people who come back from the near-death experience report entering into a realm of pure, unconditional love. Love for everyone and everything all the time without limit. That is the reality that is being described by 95% of people who enter into that realm. And I'm of the opinion that we could use a lot more of that here in the physical plane, in this world of space and time. What is needed to solve our human problems more than anything is simply that unconditional love. So I encourage people on the New Thinking Aloud channel and elsewhere to accept the reports of people who come back from the grave, who have had a brush with death and have returned, that what they're describing when they talk about this unconditional love is very real. And we can bring that into our lives, and we can act towards each other on the basis of unconditional love. As Jesus said, for example, love your enemies.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
That is doable. And that, in my opinion, is what will change the world.
Thank you. I think, and the takeaway, and I just love being a part of this conversation, in that awareness is what precedes the evolution of thought, right? Becoming aware that there's something more is what precedes the idea that there's something on the other side. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Jeffrey, yeah, one of my coaching clients was legally dead from an accident, and his speech begins, "Death is peaceful, do not fear it." Life with a disability and no insurance is what we fear, because of course it took him a long time to get back to where he was because of the injury from anyway. And you must indulge me because I have a new slide which I forgot to introduce this segment, so just humor your president.
And your
This
question
segment
is
now called, hang on, let me do it again. And your question is, hang on, let me do this.
And your question is?
All right, good. So now, Bill Buchanan, and your question is?
Good morning, Jeffrey. Bill Buchanan. When I was a young special agent of the FBI in the San Francisco office, I was working on, we called it Soviet counterintelligence matters back then. And a private citizen came in and reported that Stanford University was doing some studies on remote viewing. There was a gentleman by the name of Hal Puthoff who was involved in it. And I can't remember whether this citizen was in touch with them or in league with them, but we had several sessions in the ensuing weeks about this phenomenon. And he said, the reason I came to you guys is that the Soviets have advanced to a point where they can, he didn't use the word weaponize, but we use it now, the ability to remote view sensitive, classified, secret American, information and facilities. My question is there still some research going on at Stanford about that phenomenon?
The work on remote viewing was actually done at an organization called SRI International, formerly known as the Stanford Research Institute. It's separate from Stanford University, but the work was done there. The work was done at another private company called SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation. And the work was so successful that the CIA and the military set up their own units. There was a long-standing military unit at Fort Meade in Maryland. As far as I know, the CIA probably also still has their own units. They're typically these days operating in secret. And the reason is simply because they're so controversial, it's better to just keep it out of the public eye and not attract the normal flack that these things can attract. But we know publicly that the government funded that work for a 20-year period from roughly 1976 to 1996. And today there's an organization called the International Remote Viewing Association. The president of that association, Deborah Lynn Katz, is a guest host on my New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. And I can tell you that there are tens of thousands of people today practicing remote viewing. There are businesses that offer remote viewing consultation services to other businesses. So it is a very vibrant field.
Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Well, I've often said when you and Janelle lived in San Francisco, lived in Las Vegas, you had the most interesting dinner parties, of which I was always the most boring person there. And your friend, wasn't it John, the Colonel, when
John
George,
Alexander.
yes, there was a movie, wasn't it, with George Clooney, Men Who Talk to Goats, isn't that it? And he said he was one of the 3 people that they studied to get George Clooney's character. Can you fill in a few details?
Yeah, that's all correct. The title is The Men Who Stare at Goats. And
Oh, stare it! They stare at them.
it's sort of, the movie is tongue in cheek, but it was based on real events. And there was, in the martial arts training that takes place in the military, there was some effort to learn how to stare at a goat and actually cause it to die. So that's what the title of the movie references.
Very good. Susan Rowan.
My first experience with, I don't know what you would call it, was in Fiddler on the Roof, when Grandma Seidel came from beyond the grave to give him the message. And it was very interesting to me. First of all, this is very eye-opening. And Patricia, I think you remember Richard Thiem, who we met at NSA, Reformed Jew turned into an Episcopal priest, turned back into a Jew, who is writing and dealing with the NSA about UFOs, about afterlife. Jeffrey, I'm going to introduce the 2 of you because I really think you have something.
Oh, I know Richard Thiem very well.
Oh, good. Well, tell him I thought of him when I heard you speak. This is really a very eye-opening presentation, and the fact that there's science behind it didn't surprise me. I knew about the government funding, and the government has been very involved. A lot of our major, as you know, top-level officers have encountered things that have been recorded. But I do hear it, and boy, when my own grandmother landed on my left shoulder, I didn't think of it as parapsychology. It was her telling me what to do again, and I actually followed her wisdom. But this has been just really just eye-opening, and I thank you. And for people that didn't know, I kind of was singing along with Avinu after you said that. So I will leave you with that thought. Thank you so much, Dr. Mishlove.
Tracy Hooper.
Good morning again. When Henry and I, my husband and I, were expecting our first baby, I went into labor, and I'm 5'2", and my daughter was 9 pounds, 10 ounces, a big baby. And when I was in labor for 4 hours, I remember praying to Henry's mother, who had passed away 4 years before, asking her if she could help me deliver this baby. And I truly felt her presence in the delivery room. Was that an event? Was that what you're talking about?
Could well be. When you talk about a spontaneous event that occurred to you, it's hard for me to know objectively exactly what happened, but if it felt that way to you, I'm of the opinion that people's own reports of their inner experience need to be taken very seriously. One of the reasons that parapsychology is often dismissed, and in particular, the study of life after death is often dismissed as people say, oh, it's all anecdote. But anecdotes are people's personal reports of their inner mental experiences. So I regard it not as just a mere anecdote, but as evidence.
Thank you for that. May I ask a follow-up question, President Fripp? Okay. The other question I have is, with so much trauma in the world and people talking about the trauma that they've experienced, if they have an experience where someone visits them who has passed, do you find in your research that helps them to be more at peace with their own trauma?
I'm not sure explicitly about the trauma question, but I can tell you there has been quite a bit of research with mediums and people who have lost a loved one and then go to contact a medium to have some sort of communication with their deceased loved one. And the research suggests that this is very helpful in getting people through the grieving process.
Thank you very much.
Janelle Barlow?
Okay, this is something I've heard you talk about, Jeffrey, but I'd sure like you to share it with the group. And that's the story of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the person that she met in the hallway and so on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, the purpose of telling that story would be that people who have had encounters with the afterlife often have their lives changed in dramatic ways as a result of that. That's what happened to me. I switched from being a criminology graduate student to creating a very unique, never done before degree in parapsychology. And similarly with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who many of you may remember is the great pioneer in the 5 stages of grief. She was also one of the first people to write about the near-death experience. And in fact, she had a patient who first reported a near-death experience to her, a woman named Mrs. Schwartz. And she was doing all this work in death and dying, and her seminars were not going well. She had the idea that she should leave this field and get back to more conventional psychiatric work. And she was about to announce her decision to quit to a priest. She was at the University of Chicago. She is working with this priest. They're standing at the elevator, and she's about to tell him right then and there, I'm going to quit this work, when a woman appeared in front of her and said, may I walk with you to your office down the hall? So they began walking together down the hall. As they're walking, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross recognizes the woman. This is Mrs. Schwartz, the very same woman who first told her about her near-death experience. However, Mrs. Schwartz had died 10 months earlier. So this would be an example of what we call full-bodied materialization. Mrs. Schwartz walked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross down the hall into her office, and then she said to her, you must promise me you will never leave this field. You will continue to do this work. I want you to write down a note telling me you promise. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had the presence of mind to say to her, okay, I will make that promise. I will write down the note, but I want you to sign it. And Mrs. Schwartz did sign the note. And then she walked out of the office. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, thinking about what had just happened, she had the note in her hand and she kept it for years, holding it up in her lectures, talking about how Mrs. Schwartz had materialized and saved her career. She was later listed by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential not living Americans of the 20th century. Her work became that important. So after Mrs. Schwartz left her office, she opened the door. She looked down the hallway. She wanted to get another view of her, but there was nobody in the hallway.
Now, my question was, when Mrs. Schwartz left her office, did she go through the door or did she open it and walk out?
Yeah, I presume she opened it and walked out.
Okay, good. All right, let's just acknowledge another of your guests arrived, Janelle. Of course, Gail Rubin from your chapter, past president of your chapter, and also Claudette Good O'Neill is here because, you know, she has a coaching client right up till 8 o'clock. Arlen, you have the question.
Yeah, just have a question actually about the living, not the dead. But I know, especially with my wife being with me for 60 plus years, that when you're someplace else and you think about the same thing, like for dinner or something, is there some electronic neural thing in your brain that connects the two of you?
What a good question. And in fact, there has actually been research showing that when two people have what you could call a telepathic experience, they're having the same experience. One may be actually sending a telepathic message to the other person in a different room, and the other person receives the message. They could both be wired up to EEG equipment, and the research shows that, yes, people experiencing telepathy will also experience a certain synchronization of their brain waves together.
Absolutely.
Jeffrey, new thinking aloud. And I hope you noticed I'm also wearing not only the Golden Gate Breakfast Club pin, but your pin as well. And tell us about some of the people you interview. And one I remember when I was staying with you in your new fabulous house, and I know my bedroom is ready for my next trip. You were telling me about a chess master playing a Russian chess master. So that's two questions. The type of people you interview, and if you could retell that story just to humor me, I loved it so much.
Okay, well, the New Thinking Aloud channel is my YouTube channel. You can go to New Thinking Aloud, ALLOWED, not ALOUD. It's all one word, newthinkingaloud.com. We have over 1,000 videos. Primarily, we focus on the paranormal, consciousness research, and spirituality. Those are the three main topics. I've been doing these interviews since 1972. That's another magical story. Shortly after my dream of Uncle Harry, I had another dream that led me into this career as an interviewer. And it's been now over 50 years I've been doing that. And actually, New Thinking Aloud, the name refers to the original Thinking Aloud television series, which went out on the satellite to public television stations all across North America for 15 years, between 1987 and 2002. So, and our archive of over 1,000 videos is available on YouTube. Now, with regard to I like to call it the chess game from beyond the grave. That was one of our interviews. We interviewed neuropsychiatrist Vernon Neppe, who studied this game. He was a former chess expert from South Africa. And what happened is there was a Swiss researcher named Wolfgang Eisenweiss, an economist, but an interest in the afterlife and the paranormal. And he thought, what better proof could there be for life after death if we could get a deceased chess master to play a game of chess with a living chess master working through a medium? And he knew a medium. He had a friend, Robert Rollin, who did automatic writing and had a spirit guide. So he gave Robert Rollin a list of about 10 famous chess players who were deceased, and he said to the spirit guide, see if you can find any of these people, and would they be willing to play a game of chess with a living chess master? And they arranged for Viktor Korchnoi, the Russian chess master, who at the time was the #2 ranked chess player in the world. He agreed he would play a game with a ghost, so to speak, through the auspices of a spiritualist medium doing automatic writing. And what they found was, yes, that detailed communications began to come through from a Hungarian chess player named Geza Maraksi, who had died in 1951. And this game, we're now talking about, as I recall, 1987. And Meraxi answered hundreds of questions about his life when alive. They were about 98% accurate, very obscure questions, and played this game of chess with Victor Korchnoi. And Korchnoi won the game, but there was a point at which he thought he might lose. It appeared as if Meraxi was playing according to the style of chess he played when he, back in the 1940s, was the #2 ranked player in the world. But chess had advanced a lot since that time. And so his opening moves were weak, but he played a very strong mid-game and nearly won. But at the end of the game, Korchnoi admitted he almost lost the game, but he did win. Now, my good friend Russell Targ happened to be the brother-in-law of Bobby Fischer, the famous American chess master, maybe the greatest chess player of all time. And so he showed Bobby Fischer the results of that chess game, move by move. It had all been recorded. Bobby Fischer analyzed it, and he said, undoubtedly, this game was played at the grandmaster level. This was, a brilliant game of chess. So I regard that game as one of the really strongest examples of evidence for the afterlife.
I am impressed that you can remember, not even knowing I would ask you that question, these very intricate names. And Anastasia and I are wondering, how do you pronounce this fairly normal in comparison name? Anyway, Bert Hill, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. The question is related to memory loss while you're still alive, dementia and that sort of thing. Is it the status you're at when you die, or does somehow that come all back for you?
That is a great question, and there's a whole body of research related to it. It is known as terminal lucidity, and I can tell you that my wife Janelle has had a couple of very direct experiences with people who are dying, including my own mother, who had dementia. And in cases of terminal lucidity, which occurred with my mother, what happens is, in the most severe cases, these people are so ill they can't even sit up in the bed. They're lying in the bed. But all of a sudden, they sit up and all of the dementia is gone. They're completely lucid. She can tell you she talked to my mother for 2 hours. And it was an in-depth, heartfelt conversation about family and children and the husband and life in general, and things that my mother would not have been able to do because of her Alzheimer's prior to that point. But this is known to occur. It typically occurs within 2 weeks of a person dying. And the best explanation for it that I can think of goes back to William James' idea that the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but the brain operates more like a filter or a radio receiver of consciousness. The consciousness comes from another realm, I like to say outside of space and time completely, and that the brain is able to receive consciousness from elsewhere, so that as a person is dying and the brain deteriorates, particularly if they have dementia, it can no longer filter out the enormity of our consciousness coming from this non-physical realm. And so people are able to demonstrate abilities greater than they had when they were dying.
Thank you.
Another example, I could add that to my list. It could be a 10th line of research that points toward survival after death. Terminal lucidity is the technical term.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And having met your mother, even with dementia, she was totally delightful.
I agree.
And if you've ever seen how any son and daughter-in-law would respectfully involve Mother, and she was a total delight. So that was amazing. Claudette Good O'Neill. Obviously, Jeffrey, you can see that we are very excited about your subject. It is 9:03, and if you still have time, we'll still take some more questions. So over to you, Claudette.
So I have a story to tell you, and I don't know how to ferret it out, but I will tell you what happened. My parents were divorced and didn't get along toward the end of their lives. However, on the Father's Day before my father died, they were all together because we had a family gathering. And he reminded my mother that in her family, one partner always goes shortly after the other. In August, he died. And we were about to go to his memorial service at the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco. And my children, who were very young at the time, usually fought over what they call shotgun seat. And both of them said, no, we'll get in the back seat because Grandpa wants the front seat. And so since they said that, I drove from Pacifica along the ocean toward the Swedenborgian Church because he always loved that view. We got to the Swedenborgian Church, and if you know it, it has a little pond. And we were early, so I gave the kids pennies to throw in. One of the pennies, I swear to you, there was another adult I didn't know at the time, saw it too. The penny went in the water and then came out of the water. And when we touched it, it was wet. So I held on to it. I thought, that's special. Well, after the service, we're just standing around talking, and the penny jumped out of, like my elbow was hit, and landed near my mother's purse. I found it, and then when we went to a brunch after the service, I went to my mother and I said, does this penny mean anything to you? I said, the kids say the date's 1938. And she goes, well, that's when we were married. And she was still alive, right? For the next 3 or 4 months, my children would say, Grandpa's in the living room or Grandpa's here. And I guess sometimes I thought I felt his presence, but I didn't pay attention to it. My mother died the following January, and suddenly my children never felt their grandfather around again. It was almost as if he waited. Now, my question is, the penny thing seems unbelievable. And I don't know whether it was our imaginations or whatever that we felt that he stayed around until she died. But what have you got to say about such an odd story?
I used to be the president of a nonprofit organization called the Intuition Network. And I would say that your children and you have used your intuition to make sense of these experiences. And I encourage that. I think intuition, it means inner knowing. It's wisdom that comes from within. You will never find an outside expert who can validate your intuitions. You have to trust yourself. Ultimately, that's what in Christian spirituality, I believe it's called discernment, knowing how to distinguish between an authentic intuition and wish fulfillment fantasies. So all I can say really is trust your intuition, because I think your intuitions are correct in this case.
Have you ever heard of anything like a physical thing, like a penny doing something it shouldn't be able to do?
There are hundreds of stories like that related to after-death communications, yes, involving coincidences, little synchronicities, like a penny jumping out of the water. That would be precisely the answer. There's one example, for example, someone wrote a book where a friend of theirs had died, and the friend, they used to play marbles together, as I recall. the story, and the friend loved what's called the cat's eye marble, a particular marble. And so this person wanted to communicate with their friend, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it's everywhere they turned, there were these cat's eye marbles, like dozens and dozens of them showing up. So it does appear that people in the afterlife, at least some people, have the ability to manipulate situations in our space-time universe.
Thank you.
Mike Milstein, but
Yeah,
before
I've
you
got
ask,
I've got
just hold on 1 second, Mike, and then Colin.
Okay.
Janelle, have you collected all the addresses that people have put in the chat for Jeffrey?
You know, I had to leave for a moment because I froze on the screen. I don't know if you could see that. And so I left. And now that I'm back on, I have a brand new chat box. So I did not get those addresses.
Okay. Susan Rowan, can I delegate to you? Because I can't chat and listen to everybody and keep on track. Can you copy all the chat to get the addresses for Janelle?
I can do it by hand. I don't know how to copy a chat box.
Okay.
Oh, it's
Eva. Fenari, can you do that for Janelle, please?
yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, good.
If you just go
once
under
it's closed, I can't get them. So
Yeah.
copy it. But if anyone wants to email me, pfripp@fripp.com, I will make sure Jeffrey and Janelle get them. So we've got Mike Milstein and Colin Hussey. If you still have time, Jeffrey, I think we could go on probably all day.
I can stay for a while. Mhm.
Okay. Mike Milstein, then Colin.
Well, this just reminds me of a story relating to the subject matter. James Patterson was visiting a friend on his deathbed, and in walks the person's priest, and his friend points a finger at the priest in a very stern voice, said, "You better be right."
Mhm.
That's it.
Shit.
Well,
What can you say?
Well, and I'm sure, I don't know if he ever came back to said thank you, you were. All right, Colin Hussey.
well, this thought occurred to me while I was listening to your talk, and it it veered toward battlefields. And have you ever visited a battlefield, or where so many have fallen, and picked up anything from that? That thought just popped into my head about these massive military engagements and with lots of death and destruction, and so you have all these dead people in one place, or who had lost their lives in one general area.
I'm not really fond of visiting battlefields. I did visit the Treblinka death camp in Poland, which was a huge cemetery where many Jews had been murdered. And I can't say I felt anything at the place. It's not as if dead people necessarily hang around cemeteries. I think for the most part, they're off in other dimensions. Although there is a sense of earthbound spirits, but there is a famous case of, if I remember correctly, the fellow's name was Jeff Snow, I think. But in any case, he wrote a book about it. I may have the names wrong in this instance, but he was a fireman, and he was visiting a Civil War battlefield, and he fell into a swoon. He literally collapsed on the battlefield, and he had very specific memories of being a Confederate general. And those memories just continued to flood into him, and he wrote a whole book about it. So there are instances where people visit certain locations and past life memories are triggered. I think that's more common than, coming upon ghosts at a cemetery.
Well, I am sure I have told you, Jeffrey, that when we were very little, we lived in a house that was haunted. And my brother, who buys houses that were built in 16 something and 17 something, there's always a presence and there's always a story with the house of who it is. Anyway, I digress. With that, Jeffrey, it is 9:13. Do I see any hands? If not, do you have any concluding thoughts before we close the recording, Jeffrey?
Well, it's been a great pleasure to be with the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. This is my second experience. I did attend another meeting briefly a few weeks ago. I think you're a wonderful organization. I would say that members of the Golden Gate Breakfast Club are very fortunate to have such a talented president and so many other talented members coming in, like my wife. And so I'm very happy to be with you. And I suppose if I had a final message to share, it would be that by and large, there are exceptions, but by and large, the reports that I get from people who have had a taste of the afterlife, including my own taste of it, is that the experience is so exquisite, so filled with love and wonder and beauty, it's beyond words. And, so when I awakened from my dream, I could only cry tears of joy and sing the most sacred song I knew at the same time. That's good news. And I'm very, very happy to be able to share it with you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Pete...